Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Rational Female Podcast. And today got a great guest, Jenny Holland from Saving Culture from Itself. So I came across her channel a short while ago, and she does some really interesting stuff. And actually, I saw one of her videos and I clicked on it and I thought she'd be a typical kind of, wokest feminist, but I was very, very impressed to see that she doesn't subscribe to those views. So Jenny considers herself politically homeless, and she's got a great channel and a Substack. So today, what we're going to be mainly talking about is what problems are facing modern women in the West as to modern non-feminist or anti-feminist Western women. So, Jenny, why don't you start by telling us a little about your kind of political journey, how you got to where you are today in terms of your views?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Um, yeah, so I am a fairly typical Gen X person. I grew up in a very secular family, or at least my parents were very secular, very atheist. Their parents had been very devout Catholics, but they had abandoned that for freedom and the sexual revolution in the 60s and 70s. My parents moved around a lot when I was a kid, so I kind of bounced around and have sort of a confused national identity because of that. But I went to university. I worked in the news media for a couple of years. I worked in government for a couple of years. My father was a writer, so I was always my main skill was always writing, and always earned a living writing as a writer for hire in one way or another. But when I was back in the States from the late 90s to the 2010s, in the late 2000s, early 2010s, I started to notice this very unsettling, sort of almost like a new type of person. At first, I just thought they were sort of harmless hipsters, annoying but harmless. But then it started to take on more sort of political and racial overtones, and that's what I was sort of an early recognizer of what we now call woke. I eventually left the States, moved back to the UK, where my father was from originally, and I went to secondary school here and everything. So I have this whole Northern Irish family. Um, you know, had a couple of experiences that were very kind of eye-opening, that shifted me away from the kind of neoliberal progressive worldview. I at one point described myself as a statist, somewhat tongue in cheek. I've never been like a very doctrinaire person with labels, but I described myself that way because at the time I thought that we were living in a very well functioning state that had sort of created unprecedented material well-being and rights and freedoms. And I thought, well, I'm throwing my lot in with that because obviously it's better than living in some sort of backward society where women don't have rights, et cetera, et cetera. Now things changed. The world around me began to change, and I immediately was very uncomfortable with this sort of upside down kind of value judgments. So, like, one of the turning points was when, like the Charlie Hebdo attacks,
Oh
when
God.
the Penn Awards, there was some scandal where they didn't want to take a stand about the attacks because they didn't want to be called Islamophobic, and I just started to see that the world that I had inhabited, which was sort of intellectuals, writers, journalists, creative types, suddenly it started to feel oppressive, like everyone had to toe a line. And long story short, I voted for Hillary in 2016 because I voted from abroad, but I voted for her in 2016 because, again, I still believed that the professional managerial class was competent and it had, good intentions. And after COVID, well, before COVID, actually, the race stuff that was happening in America, like the Evergreen debacle with Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying, and a lot of the kind of activism that I saw, even in people I knew, very sort of anti-white rhetoric and this sort of like viciousness of tone that I thought was really kind of frightening and appalling. And then COVID, and that just pushed me over the edge. It just became very clear that actually the professionals running things did not have high levels of competency and did not have our best interests at heart. And they really made a holy show of it. And yeah, I basically turned to the right, whilst maintaining kind of my aesthetics and my coding. You know, as like that phrase that young people say, like I'm still sort of left or liberal coded, but I still like the same things I liked when I was living in Brooklyn, and voting for Obama. But I can see now that what happened was that woke, which is a sort of a neo-Maoist, ideological worldview. I would actually go so far as to say it's actually a morality. It's a whole new moral universe. It's more than just an ideology. Had infiltrated and taken over every institution that I could think of, and that was leading to very terrible decisions being made on the part of these professionals over that had a lot of control over our lives. And the only place to go at that point was to the right, because the liberal center was, I mean, you can tell me what you think happened to the liberal center. Did they capitulate out of fear? Do they actually really kind of agree with the woke? I mean, that's a kind of up for debate how that relationship works. But it's not really up for debate that the liberal establishment and the long-standing liberal traditions did not survive the woke hysteria. And so now, for lack of a better term, I am right wing and MAGA. I voted for Trump in 2020 and 2024 happily, and I don't regret that in any way, because there was nowhere else for me to go. Like, I cannot stand on the side of people who advocate child sex change. That's just not going to happen. I cannot stand on the side of people who mandate a vaccine during a pandemic. I just can't stand on the same side as those people, and it just became this topsy-turvy world where the right had much more principle stance of personal freedom. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's basically it in a nutshell.
Yeah, so that's very, very interesting. So I want to comment. My dad is also a writer. He's a columnist for Tanzania, and I myself am a writer. So we have that in common. I'm a published author, self-published, but yeah, I've written a lot of books. And you mentioned something about the 2010s. So I'm a bit younger than you. I'm Gen Z, 28. I'm going to be 29 soon. And I feel like my generation are kind of balls deep in this whole bizarre world. So I remember the term SJW being used a lot in the 2010s. Like, that SJW is what it used to be called back then, social justice warrior. And it was a very, very ubiquitous term. And I remember watching these YouTubers, because for me, so you describe yourself as someone leaning towards the right, and you mentioned something about the center position not existing so much, which I'll comment on shortly. But I think that what happened is that there were people who were kind of old school left leaning people, which I would describe my background and my family background, kind of old school, like labor voters, working class. That's kind of my background. And then what seemed to happen, I'm not entirely sure how it happened, and I completely agree. I think a lot of it had to do with the rise of Islam and people being very conflicted, and a lot of people, saying, oh, Charlie Hebdo, well, they shouldn't have drawn cartoons, and you're not allowed to say this and that. And people becoming very angry, which I don't want to talk too much about that on this stream, but when you really dig deep into that, it's completely ridiculous, considering this is an ideology that is so antithetical to a liberal secular worldview. So I really do remember, and I feel like I've grown up in this madness, and I myself, so I've pretty much always had the same position in terms of, I would describe myself as center left, so classical liberal culturally, but economically, a bit like pro regulators, capitalism, and redistribution, that kind of thing. Not socialist, not that far, but moderate left economically. But I have had so many bad experiences with people for years now, and just lost friends and had ridiculous fallouts with people over my opinions. And it's usually around things like Islam or the whole trans thing. And yeah, I'm of the view that the majority of people are actually centrist. I think most people are neither
Mhm.
MAGA nor woke. Most people are centrist. Most people like, I mean, you're in the UK as well, so you know here there's a pretty negative opinion on Donald Trump. I have
Mhm.
a very, very neutral view on Trump. I'm not really for or against him. I wouldn't have voted for him. I actually would have personally chosen Sanders for economic reasons, but I never liked Hillary. I liked Trump's outlandishness. I liked that he
Yeah.
was a very blunt, brash character, but I don't like his policies. I don't like his these very conservative policies, which I don't really agree with. But you know, I definitely am really happy that he was taking a stand against some things like with the Islamification of the West. I think that he feels like the only major politician who is trying to take a stand against that.
Mhm.
So what concerns me is this rise of hostility coming from people on the left, especially a lot of women. And I'm not saying it's all women, there are men who are like this too. But so my main thing on this channel is I talk about feminism and a bit of political stuff. But I think that feminism kind of sowed the seeds of this neo progressive woke ideology because feminism, and I've done a lot of research into feminism. I don't know what your view is overall, but I'm of the view that feminism, especially from the second wave onwards, it started to teach people these very strange views like patriarchy theory and gender as a social construct. And if you look at some of the thinkers like Kate Millett or Andrea Dworkin,
Mhm.
what they were saying was really ridiculous. And it was really just this desire. I think feminism was about the breaking up of the family and the breaking up of traditional relationships between men and women, which have always worked very well. Like, I'm of the view that historically men and women have always worked together, and gender roles are biological, but they're shaped by culture. So I don't think women have ever, it's an extreme position to some, but I don't think women
Yeah.
have ever been an oppressed class in the way that feminists say. I think it's more that men and women have held different roles in society. And in some cases, women have been disadvantaged, and in other cases, men have been disadvantaged. So I completely reject feminism. And, you know, I was kind of pro feminism as a teenager, but then I started to just read about it and I just
Mm.
started to do my own research and converse with people. And also just talking to feminists, what they say just sounds really ridiculous. So I feel like feminism, especially the current wave of feminism now, it's become so stupid that now, you know, people don't know what a woman is. People
Right.
have become completely cuckoo. So yeah, I think, you know, modern, I mean, I think it's sad as well because there is a lot of hate, I think, towards modern women as a group, which
Mhm.
sucks 'cause we're not all crazy. But you know, and men aren't angels either. Like there are a lot of
No.
problems with modern men. But modern women, I think women now are kind of have absorbed a narrative that is leading to think I am a victim, having
Yeah.
this grievance towards being female and this antagonism toward men. And it feels like social media and celebrities and all of the information around us is pushing women towards this very toxic feminist
Yeah.
gynocentric narrative.
Yeah. No, I fundamentally agree with that. I don't whenever I talk about feminism, which is a lot. In fact, I was just doing one yesterday, doing someone's show yesterday saying this. I always put a caveat in there in that when I was growing up, because I was the child of sort of like liberal lefty bohemians, I had a very like alternative lifestyle as a child. And because I went to good schools and I went to university and everyone was very well read and everyone, you know, not my mother, but most of the women around me and most of my friends would have called themselves feminist.
Mm.
So, I've known feminists throughout my life, my dearest friends and, women I know well. So, when I then proceed to completely slate feminism, I always wanna put a caveat in there in case any of them should hear this, God forbid. Like, it's this I'm talking about the ideology, not the
Yeah,
people.
no, yeah. So,
But, and also the one good thing that feminism has done recently, and actually it's the very small minority of feminists, is the TERFs. So TERFs in the United Kingdom, anyway. I don't think this is true in the States. I think conservatives did this in the States as well as TERFs, but no conservatives did it here, to my knowledge. the TERFs were the first ones to sound the warning bell on transgender ideology. And they paid a heavy price for it. And as you know, trans exclusionary radical feminists, the radical feminist part is the key part there. So you had this group of older women, not all of them older, but a lot of them were veterans of the 70s and 80s Rev Fem, revolutionary feminist movements. And they were still lefties. They were still feisty, commies, and they were still feminists, defeat the patriarchy. And they recognized early on that men claiming to be women was a threat to women's safety and dignity, where a lot of the rest of the mainstream did not. However, transgender ideology in general is a direct result of feminism. It's not the only cause. Feminism is not the only cause of transgender ideology, but feminist theory says that sex is a social construct, that there's nothing inherently female about being a woman, that women, there's nothing natural that binds women together in terms of their bodies. Feminism teaches women that your body is the site of your oppression. They've gone even further than that to say really crazy things like, love is the most oppressive force in the world. I mean, the second wave feminists were this group of malcontents. Some of them were brilliant, I guess. I mean, in some ways, they were certainly charismatic, but they had the most sort of hate-filled, sour takes that you could possibly imagine. And they were so embedded in academia that there's still strands of that exist now in the mainstream. It escaped from the lab.
Yeah, bang on. I mean, I'll be very blunt. I don't like TERFs. I don't support any feminists. And I actually will say this to be a bit diplomatic. I am not anti transsexuals who are adults and who have had a sex change and who have a clinical diagnosis. And the reason I say that very seriously is because I understand that there are people who suffer from gender dysphoria, a medical condition, and they have a sex change because they actually have a genuine illness. And there's somebody I follow on YouTube called Marcus Stibb. He is a transsexual man. He was born female, he became a man. He doesn't bother me because I don't have a problem with a grown adult having a sex change. What I don't like is transgender ideology in the sense that we should frame everything as the cis people, whatever buzzwords they use now. I don't like this idea of saying gender is a social construct because it is not. And my view is that if gender was a social construct, why would there be people who have a clinical medical disorder and are altering their physiology? It doesn't make sense. So I don't like this, and I understand that position. That's probably a classical liberal position in the sense that, it's up to people's lives, do what you do, just keep it to yourself kind of thing. But I also, I don't really like how it's become like we all just have to accept that people have to use pronouns, and it's like it's ridiculous. Like I can't stand it. So I think it's just like it's almost like with gay people. I think most people don't mind if like two men want to have a relationship or get married, but when you start to push things into people's face all the time and make a huge deal out of it, it becomes ridiculous. So, and it starts to be like a joke. And it's like this with everything. It's like this with people of color, with women, with LGBT people, and it's become ridiculous. So, as someone who, would say I'm quite, because I would have said once upon a time I consider myself a generally progressive person, but then when I talk to people who call themselves progressive, they just sound insane. So, and like yourself, I have had feminist friends and even feminist family members. I don't really bother with feminists anymore. I wouldn't say any of my friends now that I'm close with are really feminists. And also, I think a lot of people say they're a feminist, but they don't actually understand anything about it. They just say I'm a feminist. They have no conception of any of the research, the academia, the theory behind it. They don't even understand what it means. They just say, "Oh, I think everyone should be equal." So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because words like feminist and words like liberal and words like even socialist or progressive, they don't mean what they meant originally anymore. They just are synonymous with virtue. They're synonymous with being on the right side. And so people who like the world didn't used to be this political. Like when I was a kid, I mean, I was always interested in politics, and I had this sort of wacky family. And my dad wrote about politics, and all. My mother was a Trotskyist. So I mean, my life, my world was quite political-ish, but none of my friends' families were like this. No, not people didn't. I mean, we might have had discussions over the dinner table, like during an election or something like that, and people would tell you who they might vote for, but it wasn't like this all-consuming obsession, which I think social media has turned it into. This was the 90s before we had social media. And so it was a lot more chill. It was genuinely a lot more chill. And now, so there's this, and that combined with this sort of ripening of the long march through the institutions, because when I was going through the institutions as a high schooler and a university student, there were still old school teachers there, like old men and old women who were conservative with a small c, who were traditional in their approach, somewhat stern, very merit-based, very strict. So we still had contact. We still had physical contact with the old liberal order, which was based around meritocracy. Okay. You guys probably didn't get that. You guys probably were too young to have experienced those old timers like I did. And so the pressure on you guys to claim a liberal, feminist, progressive, woke, socialist, whatever word, all of those terms, to claim those labels was probably a lot stronger. Like I do remember, like we didn't know that many conservatives in my milieu. And I remember when I was in my 20s, I would hang out at this bar. One of the guys we used to hang out with, he was a great guy, really funny. He was a Republican, and it was always like a shock. Like, this is in New York. Like, oh my God, you're a Republican. And we would take the piss out of him. We would debate, we would laugh. It was just this fun thing. We would have these arguments about in the pub over pints, but it was very good natured, right? You try walking into a bar in Brooklyn now and saying you're a Republican and you voted for Trump. You will have a very unpleasant afternoon if you do that. Like you can't really do that anymore. So even here on the island of Ireland, I wouldn't feel comfortable doing that. So that ripening of the neo-Maoist takeover of the institutions, who James Lindsay has talked about at length over the years, very helpful kind of history he's given there. But there's many others who've done similar. That has really flowered in your generation. And that combined with social media, which reinforces messaging, which is image-based. So we kind of get dazzled by the faces and the hand gestures and the phrases that people are using to reproduce these political messages, these extremist political messages, actually. And that's kind of has a mesmerizing effect. And young people, well, all people, but young people especially, are mimetic. We learn by copying. We find our place in the world by copying and learning from our peers and learning from our betters. And that's how we arrange ourselves in terms of status. So those two things came together and really created I think, not to sound hyperbolic, but like a revolutionary condition.
Okay, so what do you think created a revolutionary condition?
So this combination of the long march through the institutions coming to pass, like maturing, and the social media, the tool of social media and its effects on young people and people's minds generally.
Okay, and you think this is basically what's created this woke revolution, per se?
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
And there's definitely other factors. Yeah.
Yeah, social media is
material factors. There
Sorry?
are material factors. There are material factors as well. Like the overproduction of cultural elites has definitely there's too many people graduating with these degrees, which are essentially indoctrination camps. But there's not jobs for them. That's another revolutionary condition. You have a large, you have large demographics who are experiencing great discontent and who cannot access the capitalist wealth creation system. Now I sound like a lefty, but this is just true. And people in MAGA are very aware of this. This is what's interesting about MAGA, is that sometimes some of its leaders, not Trump, but some of its leaders can be very, when they're analyzing the situation, they can sound almost like left-wingers, because this is the reality on the ground, right? So neoliberal economic policies are another driver as well.
Yeah, I'm very anti neoliberalism. And also, you said something earlier as well. I can't remember exactly, but so, because a lot of people use the term liberal, economic liberalism. Actually, the idea of liberalism, classical liberalism, is fundamentally about freedom. It's about freedom of individualism, freedom of liberty. And it was a very revolutionary idea because it was challenging well, I would say anyway, as a non religious person, the kind of indoctrination of the church. And it was very much challenging religion. So it was secular liberalism, and this is where you got ideas
Correct.
like human rights and the Age of Enlightenment, which I think was a very important time in human history. But
Hmm.
now liberal, because also economic liberalism is very, very right wing. I mean, I sent this. There's this article I wrote on my Substack about this. An economic liberal and neoliberalism is very, very pro a very hard laissez-faire capitalist. So
Hmm.
to say that you're a liberal now, a lot of people, like real leftists, are very, very anti-capitalist. They say
That's
capitalism
right.
is bad. And then I myself, as someone who would say I'm centrist leaning, I would say, I'm pro like social capitalist or regulated capitalism. But yeah, it's a shame that these words are being so misconstrued. And
Yeah.
when I was like 16, it was very normal for people to talk about politics, and people break friends over politics. People start arguments over politics. And I think I learned quite quickly there's things I can and can't say. And I learned to kind of censor myself. So I've actually found the internet very, very useful because I
Hmm.
started a blog in 2017 when I was 19. And I started to blog and write my opinions on the internet. And actually, it's through reaching out to people and doing YouTube and just writing that I feel like I've started to think outside the box and actually feel a bit free from all of these
Yeah.
worldviews that are around me, especially living in London. Like, it's very, very difficult. I feel like almost every woman I meet is a feminist or she uses feministic language. And I think I'm becoming a bit more sensitive now to like certain types of language that women use, like, for example, laughing at jokes that are at men's expense or anything which is like, oh, modern men are so disappointing. It's like, well, everyone's disappointing, not just men. Like, I don't think we should just blame
Yeah.
everything on one sex or the other. So I want to ask you very seriously, what do you think is the biggest problem with modern women now or facing modern women?
I think, well, it's hard to say one biggest thing. I think we've done this terrible thing to everyone post Gen X. I think Gen X, like I said, still had some contact with the old ways. But millennials and Gen Z were raised in this environment where, probably more so in the States, but it's definitely happening now in the UK, but maybe not what for millennials as much, but where the um, education system became very left wing, and so and also it was like a combination of like a left-wing education system and gentle parenting, which created this environment where every child was a special little flower who could not have consequences, who had to have all these diagnoses and had to have adults run interference for them. They had all these bullying policies at school. So children's natural process of learning and adapting and developing resilience was completely interrupted by adults, while at the same time their curricula was telling them that white people were responsible for all the world's ills, that the world was going to end in climate change, that they lived in a thing called rape culture. So they were, and some in some cases, as early as kindergarten, this messaging is starting in the United States, especially around the race issue. In kindergarten, nobody needs to know that in kindergarten. Okay, no 5-year-old needs to know that white people oppressed black people. No 5-year-old needs to know that. So they were being essentially kind of spoiled in one way, but then very burdened in another way. Now, when you grow up in that environment, first of all, you're going to feel very sort of demoralized already, because you've been told that your past is bad. If you're white anyway, your past is bad, and or if you're of color, your past is bad because you were being oppressed by white people, and if you're white, you're guilty. Your future is doomed. but also that you're a special little flower and you deserve all of the accolades and all of the best things in life. And you don't have the skills, you don't have the competency to actually deserve the accolades and the praise, right? So, like, the human life is the process of learning competencies, age appropriate competencies. And young adults were not raised in general with the same level of expectation, as in the expectation was on the child to live up to the standards. So you have these young adults who are coming out with grandiose ideas about themselves, terrible views about the past and the future. And for girls and women in particular, they're being brought up in a world where they're talking about rape culture. They're also being, the porn is very prevalent, internet porn, which didn't exist when I was a kid. And all of this creates this toxic miasma that is that is intensely demoralizing and deprives young women of their natural, what's the word? Their natural sort of joy of life. I know this because I'm now middle-aged, right? So I recognize, like, when I look back at pictures of myself, or I think back to me and my friends, and I think, oh, we had that lovely lightness of youth. And there's a lot of young women, especially if they're raised in liberal environments, do not have that anymore. That's been taken from them. Like, the light has been taken out of their eyes. So feminism is a huge, huge part of it, but it's not the sole reason. So all of the cultural messaging is telling these girls, slay queen, you're better than this, you're better than everyone else. But the adults have never given the girls the competencies that they need to actually slay queen. You know what I mean? Like, we've done the worst. We've given them the worst of all possible worlds.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen The Sopranos. It's one of my favorite shows, and I'm actually kind of shocked about how Meadow and AJ. I don't know if you're familiar with The Sopranos, but
Yes.
basically, Meadow and AJ, they talk to their parents, and I find it ridiculous. Like, it's so rude. I mean, I will say as well, I think because my background, I'm from a different ethnicity culturally, so I'm not I don't know if this is a stereotype or whatever. I want to be very careful how I word this, but I think people who are kind of have immigrant parents or parents who are not born in the West, they're kind of taught to be a bit more like polite and respectful of elders. So I have had the perception that people who are kind of more anglophonic background,
Yeah.
they're allowed to talk back to their parents. So I can't really relate to that. That's just my view. I find it yeah. But the special snowflakes thing is very, very, I really do agree. And I think we've just become in this view now where it's like everyone is, your feelings are valid and your emotions are valid. And I think there's an upside to it in the sense that I'm very glad we have more awareness now about, say, mental health, for example, about, actual genuine problems. I do think, unfortunately, things are being pushed too much. And that's the issue with this. There's these
Yeah.
big, big extremes. And that's what I would describe it very much as. It's a world of extremes. So we've got,
Exactly.
on the one hand, this very extreme, because I also think as well, like, what has fueled a lot of the kind of hard right, people like parties like, I don't know, Reform or Restore, I think they've become very popular because the left equivalent has become really, really stupid. And there's no, as you said earlier, there is no centrist, where I think most people are somewhere in the center. I think most people wouldn't really say they're left or right.
Right.
And, the division between men and women now, it's appalling. It's awful. And I will say I watched some of your videos. You were talking about your childhood, and I thought it was very interesting. I really couldn't relate to a lot of it because different generation. But I think that, like, my generation, it's very normal for people to be depressed. It's very normal for people to want to have like take their own lives. It's very considered very common, which is
Oh,
very, very
yeah.
sad. And
Yeah.
I think my generation, like, we've there's this kind of nihilistic outlook on the
Yeah.
world. And I think that a lot of the breakdowns of old systems like family and structure and marriage and responsibility, like, I'm not saying it was perfect. I don't want to be too romanticizing the
Right.
past, but I think there were things that were very positive. that have lost. Now, before
Well,
you
yeah,
respond,
yeah,
just
go
kind
on.
of one point.
Mhm.
Please, can you just say in the future, and this is really annoying, say corn instead of PORN, or grape, just because of the YouTube doesn't like those words. So if you
I'll
can
try
just
and
say
remember.
corn
Thank
and
you for
grape.
telling me.
Thank
Yes,
you.
absolutely.
That's fine. Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think what happened. So I think you could actually date this back to the original advent of liberalism in the what century was that? What would you call it? The
17th century. No,
17th
16th
century,
century.
18, yeah.
16th.
I think the liberalism, certainly in my lifetime, I think we grew up in a how do I put this? Right. Liberalism was underpinned, the secular liberalism that I grew up in was underpinned by a shared morality that was based on tradition, Western tradition, Judeo Christian values, and really, really fundamentally based in Christian values. Now, we put on top of that, we kind of built another layer, which was liberal secularism. And that was fantastic. I remember it. It was great. Everything worked. I mean, nothing was perfect, but we had rights, we had prosperity. Moderate. Not, I didn't personally didn't have prosperity, like my parents weren't in the markets or anything. But we had good health care. We had the basics of life were, and we still had good education. They seemed everything seemed figured out. So I think liberals began to take for granted that liberalism was just the common sense of society. And obviously, from World War II in the era of totalitarianism, there was a justified and understandable terror of that returning, and everyone's on the lookout for like any green shoots of that happening again. So the right, the far right, essentially was completely maligned and you know uh, amputated from the discourse, which is understandable. But it turns out that if you take away the underpinnings of Christianity from liberalism, it can't stand up by itself. Because if you don't have the shared moral understanding, then liberalism, there's little gaps in the wall that lets in a new version of totalitarianism. And liberalism on its own, because of its emphasis on individual freedom, um, doesn't have a response to that. Because if your individual freedom is, well, I personally want to do X, Y, and Z, even if that's bad for society on a macro level, liberalism has no answer to that. Now, the implication of what I'm saying, I am very uncomfortable with, genuinely, because the implication of that is a restriction of these rights. And I have never lived in that world. I don't particularly want to live in that world. But that's where I think it is heading, either for a total woke crack up or for a world in which we have to accept a restriction of these boundaries. Woke is a deliberate destruction of all boundaries. Liberalism did not have the ramparts to defend against woke. Therefore, something's got to give in this three-pointed triangle between the real conservatives, meaning people who really want to restrict and roll back modernity, and they exist, versus the zealots on the other side who want to destroy all boundaries and dissolve our bodies into some sort of like weird, I don't know what. But also they also actually really need to exert huge amounts of control over us as well. And all of us who are in the middle, who are sort of groping around trying to figure this out. I just want to say something you mentioned about when you were growing up, about how people were, a lot of people were depressed. It was common in young people. I'm reading Lena Dunham's book,
Okay.
Famesick. I really like Lena Dunham. So this is again why I'm not really
Yeah.
a conservative, because I really like Lena Dunham. I really like Girls. I think it's one of the best shows ever made. Um, and she's described, like, every time I read something by millennials or Gen Z, like a novel or a memoir, I'm like, where are you guys coming from? I mean, like uh this the depression, the medication, like these constant the pharmaceuticals that she's on. I didn't know anyone when I was growing up who was on pharmaceuticals, genuinely. I didn't
Okay.
know anyone who was there's always, like they get into these weird relationships with men where someone like a man will punch a girl. I'm like, "Is that really happening?" Like, nobody got beaten by their boyfriends. Nobody I'm not gonna say the kind of acts I'm talking about, but these, let's say, advanced practices, in the bedroom, um, like that and we were partying, we were running wild, we were hooking up, we were doing all those things, but it was I mean, by comparison, when you read these testimonies from millennials, you're like, "Where did you get such a bleak and joyless, and medicated and slightly desperate, um, like, youth culture?" Like, I mean and I was in the '90s, which was all grunge, and it was all about depression, and people were doing heroin, and, Kurt Cobain, what happened to him, so it wasn't
Mhm.
like we were, like, flower children, far from it. But compared to what came next, um, we had this youth that was very free, um, pretty non-judgmental, and um, well, it was fun. It was also fun. There was not a lot of depression.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think just to make it clear, obviously, physical, abusive relationships have always existed. I mean, I don't really
Sure.
see that as a strange thing. Uh, I will say that I think I want to touch back on what you said about liberalism. So I agree that there's a fundamental problem of liberalism that if you say I'm going to tolerate this or that, there is no kind of stability. And there's been some people like Douglas Murray, who is a kind of, conservative, but he's atheist as well. I'm pretty sure he is. He talks about the idea of cultural Christianity, and I think it's
Mhm.
kind of like having what people might call Christian values, or what I would call
Yeah.
maybe traditional values, but without praying or believing in some kind of metaphysical being. And I think that there's a lot of good in sense of like having cultures that have some kind of homogeneousness. And
Yeah.
this is a problem as well, because I think, like you said, you feel uncomfortable about the ramifications of what you're saying. I feel that way about multiculturalism because, on the one hand, I come from an ethnically diverse background and I feel quite fortunate that I have grown up around lots of different cultures. However, I can see the massive downside of that because, like, I'm from London. I never really experienced racism. I always saw lots of different groups of people. My upbringing was not, I'm not going to talk about that, whatever. But anyway, I do think there's a lot of good in seeing people of different cultures and backgrounds. However, if there isn't something that's holding people together, if there's no cultural cohesion and stability, people are going to feel all alone. They are going to seek out, casual sex or doing hard drugs or, just indulging in things that might be bad for them. So, yeah, I think it's a tough one. I think the lack of community and lack of kind of feeling like you belong anywhere is maybe why so many people of my generation are latching onto these like groups where people believe in things like non-binary or gender fluid or these very strange, very extreme distortions of reality. So I am
Mhm.
by no means an advocate for religion for many, many reasons, some of which are very personal, but I think that there's a good sense in having structure. That's where you have things like, for example, I think marriage is a very, very positive structure.
Mhm.
And, I do come from like my parents are divorced. And I think that marriage, generally speaking, has lost all of its, I don't know what the right word is. Like people don't seem to value marriage anymore. And I think
No.
that's because of feminism. And,
Yeah.
I have no idea if I'm going to get married or not. And I do think, most young girls, they dream about having a husband because they want, you want a fairy tale, you want someone to look after you. And I think that, it's a shame that these structures have kept society together, like marriage and family and community and shared values. They all seem to have just gone away. So that is kind of the downside of liberalism. So,
100%.
I guess it's kind of asking, what replaces that? And I think culture is basically what binds people together. And culture is based on shared customs, shared values, shared principles, shared belief systems. Unfortunately, in many cases, shared ethnicity, which I think
Mhm.
veers into ethno-nationalism, which I obviously don't support. But yeah, it's a it's a question which I wouldn't know how to answer, but I want to obviously explore it through discussions with others.
Mhm.
And I do think to myself, how do we move forward? And I actually do think there's a lot of good on from the online world. Like there's a lot of influencers now, some of whom, I watch who do talk about things like self-improvement and things about
Hmm.
reaching out to other people. And I think it's good to find groups of people where you can actually find a way to fit in. So I think that finding groups of people who are similar to you and finding ways to fit in with them is one thing. But the core thing I would say, and this underpins all of my kind of online work, is I think we need to just stop with the feminism. Because I
Yeah,
think when you divide men and women as a unit and you say, right, you put them in the framing of men are oppressors and women are victims, I think that's a big problem. So that is
I agree.
my actual view. My thing is, I don't know how to solve all the other cultural issues, but I would say that my work is based on very much challenging feminism and
Right.
saying, look, we got to go back to saying, men and women belong together. That's, yeah.
Do you find when you're interacting with men your age that that message resonates with them, like socially interacting with men? Or are they shocked by that? Because I would imagine a lot of women are shocked by that.
Yeah, most men I meet are not feminists. They quite like the fact that I have these views, but I think it's a problem as well. Like the men of my generation are very, very. I don't want to sound rude. I don't know how do I put this. They're not very conventionally masculine. I think it's
No.
something which I've had to accept over the years. I write romance books, and I only realized recently, like when I was reading back on them, I was writing about young people at university, and I realized I'm just writing about my generation. Like it kind of sucks, but I feel like, the idea of a traditionally masculine man, I don't really see that in the men of my generation, their 20s, 30s, even early 40s, like which is obviously a bit older, but like it's not so common. I think that is also one of the reasons why I don't like feminism, because I think a lot of women now are really, really broken because they can't
Hmm.
find a man. And the problem is that women now end up being angry at men. You shouldn't be angry at men, you should be angry at feminism because it basically destroyed masculinity in men. So when you get rid of what makes a man and you say,
Yeah.
men are crap. But yeah, a lot of men like my views. I think my audience is largely male, but it's hard because you know you kind of, I mean, I don't know, I think dating now is just a massive disaster. That's a whole nother conversation, but
Right.
yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, there are masculine men. They're just not in London or New York.
Yeah.
You go to cowboy country, and you'll find them. Although I will tell you, the even in the United States, the reddest states of the United States, the schools have been captured by woke ideology and transgenderism and all that. But you'll still find people who live in more traditional um, communities that at least have the skills and the presentation of natural sex roles. They do exist. They just don't live. They can't live in places like London or New York, um, or they're like hen's teeth finding them. I mean, yeah. I mean, I think the problem. I think that feminism is essentially something that was dreamed up. Well, it wasn't dreamed up by a teenage girl, but it sounds like something that was dreamed up by a teenage girl who's just been told by her dad she can't go to the dance with her boyfriend.
Okay.
It's like this foot stomping, like men are mean, like absolute. Like
Yeah.
I can't quite believe that it's gotten so much traction because it's like, I'm sorry, men created civilization
Yeah.
uh, for
It's true.
us and
Yeah.
in partnership with us. And women have
Absolutely.
always had massive social power, massive family
Absolutely agree.
power. Women have always been the enforcers of the moral order. So to turn around and be like, but we were never given the vote. Like, I'm like, okay, fair, but what about everything else? So what the feminists did was, because they had this perception, this mistaken perception that life, like all of human history, was just a one long parade of oppression against women. They throw out tradition, throw it out. Well, it turns out that tradition also protected us. Yes, as you
Yeah.
mentioned, at times tradition did oppress, or whatever you want to call it, mores, cultural mores, um, did have oppressive results, and kept women somewhat curtailed in some ways. However, it also protected us. And now we don't have it anymore. And now we have men in our changing rooms, and we are not allowed to say, get the F out of here, you pervert. Like, we're not allowed to say that.
Yeah, yeah,
You
for
know,
transport, absolutely.
and men aren't allowed, like the men of the, the Rotherham stories, all those gangs, the fathers that went to try and defend their daughters, were arrested by police. Like, so actually masculinity is actively punished
It
by,
really is. Oh my God, yeah.
a man stepping in to defend a woman, for example, from can you imagine what would happen if a man stepped to another man in a dress in a woman's changing room? The man in not the dress would be
Yeah, in
banged up
trouble.
for like the rest of time, and like that's a real problem. But yeah, feminists made this grievous error in assuming that, and they did this from the beginning. It wasn't just the 60s and 70s feminists that did this. I mean,
Oh yeah,
the ones in the 19th century were deranged as well. I mean, look, I'm very appreciative of
absolutely,
the
yeah.
vote. I'm appreciative of the vote, but after that, like everything after that was absolute crap.
Wow, no, I want to high five you. Absolutely agree. And also, I'll make it for the record, because I don't know if you know Janice Fiamengo, but she's a retired
Mhm.
English professor who talks
I
about.
watched your
I had
video
so
with
much.
her. I
Okay,
watched your video with her actually getting ready for
yeah,
this, and I
she's
have one of
great.
her
Lovely
books, and
lady.
yeah, I know her work.
Yeah, because she, it's very correct. The vote wasn't even a feminist victory. It was actually because of the war, but also because of the rise of democracy in other Western countries. So Simon Webbs has this book, he's a historian, called The Suffragette Bombers, which basically talks about all the damage the suffragettes did. And it wasn't even the suffragettes, it was actually the suffragists who were calmer and more laid back. But another problem that people forget is that, most men couldn't vote. Voting was not a sex
I
based thing,
know.
it was a class based thing. Yeah. So, well, I know just the audience might not know. So, voting was basically, it was people of lower classes who couldn't vote. And also, the suffragettes were very racist. They didn't care about black people, they didn't care about people of color.
They
So,
were
there's
they
that
were very
issue as well.
classist as well. They were very
Yeah, yeah,
bourgeois. They were bourgeois
absolutely.
snobs.
Well, that's
Yeah.
very much prevalent in the modern kind of liberal, like when you think of people like Robin DiAngelo, just the worst kind of person. You just, this I can't stand it. And these books now, like White Fragility and white people bad. I mean, your video, the one that I actually saw, the first one of yours, you were talking about Renee Good, not my idea. It was actually so interesting. It's why me to make a video on the same topic. But
Oh yeah, I
yeah,
saw that. Yes, that's right.
yeah.
Yeah. It's a
Yeah, but because
crazy
it's so
book.
interesting. Oh my god, it's horrible.
No,
And
I
you're
mean,
right. Why are we telling a
everyone should be
5-year-old?
aware of this. Yeah, no, it's
Yeah,
insane. It's
yeah,
the most racist thing I've ever seen in my life.
very racist. I think it's awful, and I think it's very sad because, like, one of the things I hate about wokeism and I call it neo-progressivism. That's the word I use. Is that people now, it's a hierarchical based world. So if you're black or gay or trans or female, you're at the lower end. If you're a white person or heterosexual male, you're at the top. There's no like looking at people's humanity, but
Nope.
also it ignores such a big question. All people throughout human history have suffered. You said your
Yes,
background is
exactly.
Irish, so Irish people suffered drastically. The Irish are ridiculously suffering. Jewish people have suffered. There's anti-Semitism, that's a problem. Italians, Italian Americans, Eastern Europeans, if everyone has suffered. It's ridiculous. It's like
I know.
say that white people are responsible for everything, and if you are not white, then you're somehow suffering. It's such a horrible, and I actually feel very sad for a lot of white people now, like
I do too.
intellectual people, because I kind of feel like myself, because I'm obviously a black woman, I can say things, and because I'm also, and this is also really irritating. Like I think an intelligent person was here. I'm actually not very conservative. I would say, consider myself centrist leaning. But, I've been called conservative or right wing for my views, or even for wanting to talk to people like yourself who maybe come from positions that are slightly different to me. And it's ridiculous. I'm just an open minded person. I like to think outside the box. And I wish that we could have more open discourse. And, I've met some very, very interesting, intelligent leftists, and the majority of them turn out to be nutters. They just stop talking to you. They don't want to bother with you. They'll just call you names over
Yeah.
nothing. I can't
because
stand it.
their thought system is a lie, and so it provokes, like, emotional turmoil when you're confronted with that. But I mean, you must have so many stories of, like, you because people just must assume immediately just by looking at you, like, "Oh, this is a woman of color. She's gonna be a feminist. She's gonna be woke. She's gonna be all this and that in London," right? So I'm assuming you must get this all the time, and it must be intensely irritating to, like, I mean, have you been I'm asking this, I'm sure the answer is yes, but, like, have you been approached by, like, white women who try and, like, explain racism to you and stuff like that?
Not approached, but I've had white females in my life trying to explain racism to me, and I've tried to, because I'm quite a generally logical person, so I just say okay, and I try and talk it through them very seriously. But inside, I feel this huge irritants. And you're right, I'm sure. I mean, I don't think about it too much, but I used to have bright red hair, and I guess people assume that like I don't really think about it because maybe I don't think about it that much, but I guess people would look at me and assume that I have these views, and they listen to me talk and be like, okay, no, she doesn't think like that. But I think it's very sad, and I think the majority of people, and I think you've said this as well, it is mostly women who tend to lean more towards these opinions, and more men now are becoming increasingly like conservative. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's ridiculous, and I think also well, for me, these people, and I would say they sound to me like religious fundamentalists. They sound like religious extremists. That's how it sounds to me because, it's like they're preaching to me some kind of religious doctrine that I don't
Mhm.
want to listen to. So it's really bad. And I think it's a pain in the butt, really.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I sometimes think, I mean, I am very optimistic. I say this almost every conversation I have with someone. Because everything, the topics are similar and it's always quite dire. I mean, I do think the situation is pretty dire in many ways, but I'm very optimistic just because, I have a basic education in history, basic, and I know that humanity has overcome far worse. There's really nothing new under the sun except for technology. I'll give that one caveat. And fundamentally, I I just am very impressed by human beings. I think human beings are capable of incredible things, especially, and this is very important, regular normie people can just absolutely surprise you with kind of brilliant analysis, surprise skills. Like, just I've just been around the world long enough, in the world long enough to come upon people because I grew up in a very my parents weren't rich at all actually, but we were in like a cultural elite world. So everyone I knew was educated, PhDs, poets, blah 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 blah. And so my first my meetings with like regular people, were as an adult mostly, or actually no, not entirely, as a kid as well, because we lived in a village in Italy. But those people were always struck me as being incredibly capable, incredibly bright. And I like to quote Steve Bannon when he says, like, I would put the running of the country in the hands of the first 10 people who show up at a Trump rally in MAGA ball caps than I would with the current professional managerial class administrators of the state. And I agree with that. I fundamentally agree with that. I've worked with firefighters, I've met people from all walks of life. And I think like normal people really have a handle on things. The internet makes us all feel really deranged and obviously has really done, and woke ideology and all this stuff has done a huge amount of harm. But I think we're an ingenious species. The worst thing, the sort of the most extreme thing I think sometimes is we're going to need to turn the internet off, which I don't want to do at all because not only do I make my living on the internet, I love the internet.
Wow, yeah, brilliant. So I think that's a fantastic way for us to end. And thank you everyone for tuning in. And yeah, I think obviously it's actually good to be optimistic. It's a fresh change. I think that we should remember that humans as a species have overcome a lot of adversity. And we are capable of overcoming whatever madness we're in. And I'm hoping that I like to think that in my lifetime, I will see some of this madness die out if I live long enough. So that'd be pretty cool. But thanks everyone for listening. And this is Jenny Holland from Saving Culture from itself. She has a fantastic channel, very common sense stuff. This is the Rational Female tuning out, and I'll be live again next with a person who has been on the channel before, Theo Snodgrass. So we'll be live next Saturday on the 25th. So see you then. Thank you.
Thank you.